Welcome to round 4 of the Nova Scotia Labor Day Open 2024 tournament. This round was on the last day of the tournament, and I was getting pretty tired at this point. If you haven't watched the round 3 game, go check that out for sure. It was a pretty intense game, and it went kind of late into the evening, and this was the next morning, and I was still feeling pretty tired and worn out. And not only that, but I was going to be playing against another high-rated opponent. So I knew it was going to be another challenging game. And I was actually, let me switch my view here, I was actually a little bit intimidated by this opponent, actually. She had played in the same tournament as me before. The two of us had never played against each other, but she was around my rating at that time, maybe a little bit higher. And she, for most of that tournament, she was the clear winner in our section. It was a 5-round tournament, and after round 4, she was 4-0. She had won all 4 of her first games, and she actually lost her last game and ended up in a tie for first. But since then, she's gained several rating points, and I saw that she was over 200 points higher rated than me at this point. So I knew this was going to be a tough game. I wasn't sure what kind of chances I had, but you know, this is how it goes. We're gonna give it our best shot. So I was playing with the black pieces, and I played the Caro-Kann opening, and everything seemed mostly normal until this point. Just turn down my volume here. There we go. Until this point. So I was expecting her to capture with the knight. That's what I often see. And we go into this line, which is called the Caro-Kann variation. Alternatively, there's this interesting little line, which is similar to something I often play as white, with this queen e2, and there are a few little tricks and traps with this line. One very simple one being, if black develops the other knight seemingly naturally, then white actually gets a very quick checkmate. So a few nasty little traps in there. But instead, she played knight g3, which I thought looked a little bit passive. Probably it's perfectly fine, but I had never encountered this before, so I wasn't quite sure about this position, but it didn't seem like white was playing in the best way. I decided to fianchetto this bishop because I didn't know yet what I wanted to do about this bishop, and I didn't know yet what I wanted to do with this pawn. So I decided to fianchetto. Before completing my fianchetto, I figured this bishop might eventually end up on this square. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll go here, and she could just move her knight out, and that's what she ended up doing, and it was perfectly fine. But for some reason, I was thinking that maybe she would play f3, and it would kind of weaken her position a little bit. She did not play f3. She played knight f3, and I just left my bishop there, completed my fianchetto. When my bishop was challenged, I went ahead and traded it because that's often what happens in these sorts of positions, and I am going to end up with quite a few pawns on light squares anyway, so that's feeling okay. I castled, she brought out her bishop, and now I felt like my plan at some point is to break on e5. And I can't do that right away, but I figured, I can complete my development with this knight and then push this pawn. And then there's also potentially this nice juicy e4 square if I can manage to make that work, maybe sliding my rook over or something like this. So I developed my knight, she castled, and I went ahead and played e5. And then at this point, she played b3, and I was a little bit surprised by this move too, because again, I feel like it's not really the best move in this position. Like, I'm not really sure what it accomplishes. I guess it opens up this bishop for maybe some interesting play over there, but it really doesn't address anything in the middle here. And so I figured out, well, I can just capture here, and now she has an isolated pawn weakness. Now, this is an isolated queen's pawn position, and I recognized that I don't really know how to play isolated queen's pawn positions, but one thing I do know is you often don't want to allow this pawn to push. And I correctly evaluated that I can just stick my knight in front of that pawn, and it's a blockade, and that pawn is not going anywhere, right? So not only that, but that actually comes with tempo because I'm attacking that pawn with my bishop now that my knight moves. She added a defender. I added another attacker, so I'm still threatening that pawn. And then she played bishop c4. And so this attacks the knight. Technically, I could have captured here. I don't even know if I really evaluated that. I probably did during the game. I guess if I capture here, then she can trade, or maybe I'd capture and she captures right away. I'm not sure. I don't know how deeply I looked into that. Maybe capturing would be an interesting idea. I feel like in some lines I just end up with a weak pawn on this square, and maybe it doesn't work. So what I did instead is I played knight f6. And what this accomplishes is it means if she captures that knight, then I can always keep a piece in front of that pawn rather than needing to create my own isolated pawn. Even creating my own isolated pawn, I feel like would be okay, especially later in the game, like when we get into the end game, because then we both have dark squared bishops and her isolated pawn is on a dark square, so I'm always the one attacking and she's always the one defending, basically, especially once the queens come off the board later. But anyway, I played knight f6 to keep a knight on this square. She started activating her rooks, as did I. And here I decided she has an isolated pawn, and that probably becomes more of a weakness as we simplify into an endgame. And so I thought, let's see if we can get some rooks off the board and bring this thing down into an endgame that I may be able to win. So I attacked the rook with my queen, not really forcing captures, but pretty much forcing captures. And then she played here, I guess, trying to harass my queen over here. And I decided I can pretty much force the other rooks off of the board now. And that's what I did. She moves the king to safety, and now I play this queen move, which seemed like a pretty sensible move, putting pressure on a lot of things in White's camp. But I did notice when I was calculating this line that I wasn't quite sure what to do about queen e2. And indeed, that is the strongest move, and it's the move that she played. And I didn't see anything better than to just trade queens here. There may be something a little bit better. I guess I didn't analyze this position really closely. I feel like there might have been some obscure line that was better here. Like I looked, maybe like queen to b1, I think is what the engine wants. But that seems kind of scary to me because now the queen is almost trapped, right? Like especially if the white queen comes here, let's just play it out. Like if the white queen comes here, now my queen doesn't have any escape squares. Like maybe my queen can tuck in here, but like if the bishop goes here, what am I gonna do? Am I gonna, be able to get out? I don't know. So I think the engine likes queen b1. I did not like queen b1, so I did not play queen b1. I played queen d2 instead. She played queen e2, and we traded queens. So now we're down into an endgame, and the thing I didn't realize about this endgame is that the bishop pair becomes very strong. This isolated pawn perhaps is a weakness, but the bishop pair is very strong. And so being able to trade off this light squared bishop for one of my knights would actually be really strong for me. And then again, like even if that means that she manages to connect her pawns, I still might have chances. And if that trade happens here somehow, with these two pawns sort of stuck against each other, then again, my bishop is the one attacking, her bishop is the one defending. So it seems like this should be okay for black. So the best move here was actually knight e4. And the reason is now the knight can either come here or even up here on d2 or d6 and can potentially trade off that bishop. And if the knight ends up coming up here before that bishop gets to move, then it pretty much forces the bishop trade, because if the bishop moves out of the way, then I win this pawn. But I did not see the knight e4 ideas. I was still pretty focused on trying to win this pawn somehow. I felt like this is an endgame, so I'm going to bring my king. And she immediately starts pushing on this side of the board. And I wasn't really sure how to handle that. I just felt like, well, if I can try to gain control in the center, then that seems like in principle it should be better than her pushing on this side of the board. But we'll see. She ended up causing me quite a few problems over there. So I also did this. This ends up creating some sort of dark squared issues on this side of the board. And actually this square ends up becoming a really good position for her knight. And so this was not really the right idea. My thought was I wanted to kick this bishop back, bring my king, and then try to find a way to maneuver my knights so that I'm attacking this pawn a little bit better. Again, here, knight e4 works. That idea still potentially works in this position, but of course I didn't see it before. Why would I see it now? So I played b5. She moved the bishop back, and then I continued bringing my king. She activated her king. I brought mine closer, and she pushed that pawn. So now the plan that I went with was, again, trying to reroute this knight so that it's actually attacking this pawn, and then maybe moving this knight somewhere, either back here or replacing that knight on d5, and continuing the blockade of that pawn. So I started that plan. She brought the knight here, which was pretty active, but I figured I can still bring this knight here and challenge that knight. And, if she takes, then I can probably even just take with my king. What I didn't see until after I had played this move was this. And when in this position, when I saw that she could play knight e4, I thought I had blundered completely, actually. I thought that, this completely destroys my plan of bringing the king. It forces my king to go backwards, maybe sideways, but then sideways she can just bring the knight over here. And I felt like things were not going well for me at this point. It turns out that I'm still okay, but I definitely should have earlier dealt with some of these weaknesses so that she didn't have quite as easy of a time getting her knight in. So she played knight e4. I took the king back a little bit. She put the knight on c5, a really nice square. And I brought this knight over, which was my plan all along. But unfortunately, it doesn't really do much good against this isolated pawn anymore because she just simply trades off her knight for that one. And so that kind of removed all of those ideas. I could have also potentially done this, but I was still really focused on trying to win that pawn. And I felt like I didn't want to create my own isolated pawn weakness. So I took with the king. And she just continued marching her pawns down the board on the king side. And with this bishop here, in a lot of lines, I would end up losing a pawn in this position. I guess if I took right here, then I'm okay. But it gets her bishop really active and splits my pawns. And yeah, there were all kinds of issues going on this side of the board now. So I move my king back over. She continues pushing. She wants to lock my bishop in jail. I played a6 just kind of as a waiting move and to kind of cover this pawn because I felt like there were also potential issues here, especially if I ever wanted to push my c pawn. She brings her king. I get my bishop kind of out of danger. And then she played this really important move, a4. And I think I was still tired, as I mentioned earlier, but I was so focused on this pawn being pushed to lock things down, or this pawn taking. I was trying to calculate all the things that could happen in this case. I was also calculating what could happen here and whether this bishop could cause any trouble on this side. What I completely missed was that part of the point of this pawn push was to bring the bishop. And that actually is a skewer and loses material for me. And I completely missed this. I obviously, my brain was not in the right place during this game to be able to see those sorts of tactics, unfortunately. So what I decided to do is bring the knight here, add sort of another defender over here, and potentially hitting that pawn, maybe forcing her to push. But of course, she just plays bishop a3 anyway. And at this point, honestly, the game was lost. She is a strong enough player that once she's up material like this, and with the amount of activity that she has and the bishop pair, there's not a lot I can do. So I move the king back. She pushes the pawn. Yeah, I guess it's worth noting that moving the king back and defending the knight doesn't work because of this pawn push. And so now the knight either needs to move and I lose the bishop, or I do something else and you know, what actually happened is I just brought my king back so that at least I would win an additional pawn out of the exchange. But now I'm down a bishop for a pawn, and there's not much left. This bishop is just going to completely demolish me at this point. So I try to activate my king a bit. She keeps pushing pawns. I try to keep things closed down, blockaded as much as I can, keep her king out. At least my pawns and my king are sort of blocking her infiltration at all. And so we keep shuffling. This was kind of a desperado move to try to break out somehow. But of course, after this, like, I'm still blockading everything, except for that square, I suppose, but this square is blockaded. But there's just not a lot I can do. I thought maybe I could make a passer on this side of the board to cause some problems. And I did, but now she can just simply blockade this passer, and she has a light squared bishop, and my pawns are on light squares. So there's not a lot left to be done. I shuffle my king, she brings her bishop, and simply wins my pawns. Actually didn't win that pawn right away, I guess because she didn't want to lose that one or something like this. Brought her king in. I tried to defend, and she just pushed this one down the board at the cost of a bishop, but then she gets a queen. And so I played this one out till checkmate. Obviously, this is completely lost at this point. It was kind of interesting, actually, that we sort of shuffled around, and then she started pushing her pawn, of course, to make another queen. And I thought, oh, if she just like really quickly just goes ahead and promotes that pawn to a queen, then that is actually stalemate. And I thought, what do you think are the chances? Could this possibly happen? No, of course not. Of course, you know, someone at her level is not possibly going to stalemate me. So she moved the king and then promoted, and checkmate came very quickly. So this was an interesting game. I definitely don't feel like I played as well as I did in round 3. Definitely check out that video if you haven't already. Because yeah, like I feel like I did okay in the middle game against the isolated pawn. I feel like I blockaded it pretty well, but then I just didn't really find the right way to convert when we got to the end game. I overestimated how much of a weakness the isolated pawn was, and underestimated how much of a strength her bishop pair was. And so trying to get rid of the bishop pair rather than trying desperately to get rid of that isolated pawn was probably the right idea. And then that move where I pushed a pawn here, trying to kick her bishop out, weakening my dark squares and allowing her knight to kind of zigzag in, was also a bit of a positional mistake. So interesting game. And I mean, one of the lessons is you always got to stay sharp. Like when way back here, let's see if I can find it really quickly. Back here, when she pushed that A pawn, you know, not getting tunnel vision, thinking about all the things that are happening over here and all the things that are happening over here, but trying to figure out like, what is my opponent's plan with that move? And I didn't even see the plan to move that bishop to A3. And that's the sort of thing where I feel like if there's a lot going on, or if there's something that you're really focused on, it's important to kind of take a step back for a second and look at the board and see like, okay, what other things could be going on other than the things that I'm focused on specifically, like these pawns rolling down the board or this tension that I have to figure out what to do with. So yeah, another loss, but another loss to a pretty highly rated opponent. It was a fun game. There's definitely some things to learn. And stay tuned for round 5 coming soon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.